How many of you just want the semester to be over right now? A lot of you, right?
Yeah.
But, so today's good. All you can do from today is get extra credit, learn some things. And the background of Hunter is that he took my Psych 470 Advanced Abnormal class 12 years ago. Can you believe that? 12 years ago.
Yes. Dr. Weimer's been a longtime supporter of my work and the work I do through Bipolar Recorder, and it's always a huge honor to be here, so thank you very much. All right, how's everyone doing today? Yeah,
Good.
some reluctant thumbs up. This is the 7th presentation I've done here at Penn State. I come out, and each time I do 2 separate presentations. And so this is our presentation for April 2026. My name is Hunter Keegan. Here are just some overarching goals before we get too much into the detailed subject matter of this presentation. And here are some things to think about as I go through the next 20 to 30 minutes of material. So first of all, we're going to be thinking and discussing a bit about how mental illness impacts communities. We'll also be discussing just one example of a serious mental illness, or SMI, and my personal journey with it. And then we'll talk about brainstorming new mental health resources in your community. Okay, those are just some general guiding things to keep in mind as we go through this. So here's a bit more about myself and who I am and why I'm here. I'm 33 years old. I actually just turned 33 earlier this week. Every time I come out here, it kind of freaks me out a little bit just because, I get older. And y'all are primarily, I'm assuming, in your late teens, early 20s. So I know there's a little bit of a generational divide of sorts, but I am 33. I'm currently living in Roanoke, Virginia, which is a small city in Southwest Virginia. But I'm originally from outside of Washington, D.C. I graduated from Penn State with my Bachelor of Science degree in psychology back in December of 2014. And now in April 2026, it's like, wow, that was actually quite a while ago. So it keeps it interesting every time I come out here to hear from you all during the Q&A and discussion. So yeah, we can talk more about maybe what's changed and what hasn't changed since the time I was out here. My professional background primarily involves social services and corporate talent acquisition. Because I actually decided to attend Penn State because Penn State had, back in the 2010s, and probably still today, it was one of the most robust IO, industrial organizational psychology programs in the world. And I knew that was the subfield of psychology that I was most interested in. So I attended Penn State. While I was here, I worked in some research labs. I took classes with faculty such as Dr. Weimer himself. And I used that academic background to, get traditional jobs over the last 10 years. I don't talk too much about what I do by day during presentations like this, simply because I like to keep a bit of a professional boundary between my mental health outreach work and what I do, 9 to 5. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 2015, and that really threw me for a loop. It severely derailed my life. For about a year. I had just graduated college. I thought I was on top of the world. And then next thing I knew, I was literally in a psychiatric hospital. So we'll get more into how that played out in just a few minutes. Since 2021, in addition to my traditional day job career work, I've also led an independent mental health outreach mission called Bipolar Recorder Project. You'll see I've used this branding down here in the slideshow. That's the logo for Bipolar Recorder Project. And I'll spend a little bit of time talking to you all more about that too towards the very end of the presentation. Now, what exactly is mental health advocacy? Literally, why am I standing here right now? I'm not a student here anymore. And, so what is this? Mental health advocacy is what a lot of people have called the type of work that I do through Bipolar Recorder. It's a general term used by a lot of folks and organizations to describe publicly sharing about mental health and resources for supporting people with mental illness. That's the working definition that we'll use for the purposes of today. And it can take many forms. It ranges, and I always like to remind people about this, This ranges from like individual conversations that you have maybe with friends or family, all the way to like much larger scale stuff like political lobbying groups like National Alliance on Mental Illness. They actually conduct advocacy work, as they call it, at like the federal government level, helping get legislation pushed through that they endorse. Then we have examples like Bipolar Recorder or Smart Recovery. Those are what I would consider independent peer support collectives. There are the probably most general example or the most traditional example of that could maybe be Alcoholics Anonymous. If you're familiar with these different peer support groups where people come together and they support each other, but they are not necessarily like psychologists or mental health professionals, right? And then of course, regarding other advocacy work, multimedia content. So I'm an author. I've brought some of my books with me, and there are many types of work like that. So a much more high profile example would be Carrie Fisher's book, Wishful Drinking, which came out quite a while back, but it's considered a very noteworthy piece of advocacy work involving bipolar disorder and Carrie Fisher's experience with it. Carrie Fisher is Princess Leia from Star Wars. Yes, everyone knows that still. Cool. We'll move forward. So, why is mental health outreach important? And why is advocacy important? Why is outreach important? Outreach is kind of what I consider to be the next step after advocacy, where you actually go out into the community and talk about mental health resources. Now, this is why it's important. Mental illness can have devastating individual and community impacts. This slide is very heavy. I know this is very sobering to talk about, but suicide is a leading cause of death in the United States. It's a public health crisis. And it's very complicated, very multifaceted, and unfortunately, as you can see from this graph over here, which I pulled from the CDC's website, they have a lot of really good statistical breakdowns about the suicide crisis. And you can see since the year 1999, the graph starts at 2000, so it's increased significantly over the last 25 to 30 years. So this is a crisis that has been attempted to be resolved in many different ways, but it still seems to be happening. You can see it plateaued a little bit, went down just a bit, and then it spiked back up during the COVID lockdowns. So just something to keep in mind. And here are a couple of examples of how suicide impacts different populations. Because one of the really interesting things about the data involving suicide, and I'm not going to go into a deep statistical lecture about anything, but it is interesting to think about how different populations are impacted by suicide differently. And these are just a couple of examples down here. So as psychology students, you've probably heard this before, but men are more likely to die by suicide, whereas women are more likely to attempt suicide. And also, one of the reasons I specifically come out to Penn State is because suicide is one of the top 3 leading causes of death for young adults in the United States. But the only outcome is not suicide, of course. I mean, there are also other negative impacts that can involve homelessness, substance abuse, limited professional or educational growth. A lot of people who are living with mental illness are not necessarily able to always hold down jobs if they are not taking care of themselves, if they're not receiving proper treatment, or haven't established a productive day-to-day baseline, if you will. So that's important to think about too. It isn't just the most extreme outcome of ending your life. It can also be outcomes like losing your job, losing your home, losing your family, losing personal relationships. And so these are just some of the general reasons why it's important to conduct mental health outreach and support mental health advocacy. I told you we would use one example of serious mental illness for the purposes of today's conversation. So I'm going to talk to you all about bipolar disorder, which is what I live with. I live with bipolar disorder type 1. So let's just go on a very basic, broad level overview about what bipolar disorder actually is. Bipolar disorder is a mood disorder characterized by prolonged, elevated, meaning manic and or hypomanic episodes. Those episodes can last for weeks or months at a time, which I really want to emphasize because there's a common misconception that bipolar disorder means that you are maybe flipping 1 minute to the next. And that's not typically the case for like traditional bipolar disorder. We're talking about very disrupted life functioning that can last for weeks or months. So those two types of bipolar, type 1 and type 2, those are just a couple of general categories that different bipolar symptoms are grouped under. So type 1 involves full manic episodes, whereas type 2 involves only hypomanic episodes and periods of major depression. When we talk about bipolar disorder type 1, for the purposes of today, you can think of that distinction as involving the manic component. And we're not going to get into a bunch of minutiae, just like with the CDC data. I just want to clarify specifically what we're discussing when we say type 1 or type 2. A manic episode is an acutely elevated mood that interferes with life functioning. Again, we're going to emphasize that life functioning detrimental impacts. This isn't just like having a bad day. This is the type of mental health episode that could cause you maybe to stop taking care of yourself, maybe cause you to wind up in dangerous situations. A couple of examples of symptoms associated with mania would be really highly increased energy levels, erratic behavior, euphoria or dysphoria, anxiety, racing thoughts, irritability, very goal-directed behavior. So some people who have manic episodes, they might find themselves using narcotic substances more heavily, maybe participating in like problematic gambling, things like that. And those are just a couple of examples. They don't apply to every single bipolar person. But if you read about bipolar disorder and people who experience it, you'll likely see those types of themes coming up. Hypomania is mild mania, like a milder, it's still an elevated mood episode, but it's not so severe that it may land you in like a psychiatric hospital or involve psychotic features. Major depressive episodes are the flip side of hypomania and mania, and I think people are more familiar with depression generally than mania. So just for today, this would be a dramatically lowered mood that lasts most of the day, nearly every day, for 2 weeks or longer. Again, highlighting those extended periods of depression. Something interesting about depression is it looks a lot different from person to person. There are some people who encounter depressive episodes where, maybe they're sleeping excessively, like sleeping like 18 hours a day and not like getting out of the house. Whereas there can be other individuals who have problems with insomnia when they're depressed and like can't sleep at all. So I just think that's interesting to talk about the different symptoms that people can have, even though they share that same bipolar diagnosis. I mentioned psychosis very briefly just now, but I want to talk to you a little bit more about what psychotic features are in bipolar disorder. Some people with bipolar disorder type 1 and bipolar disorder type 2 can experience psychosis, which are breaks with reality. Not everyone with bipolar disorder 1 or 2 has psychotic symptoms, but some people do. And I'm actually one of those people. I do have type 1 with the psychotic features subtype. So delusions and hallucinations are what we're referring to there. Delusions are false thoughts, and hallucinations are false sensory perceptions. So example of a delusion may be you think that you are under surveillance. Like you just have this paranoid idea that there is someone following you. That's why I used this image from 1984 up here, the mass surveillance, the paranoia, that kind of stuff. Whereas like a hallucination may involve hearing a voice or like seeing something that isn't truly there. What's important to point out here, and the reason I included this slide in the presentation is because psychosis is not the same as psychopathy. So psychotic features do not mean psychopathic or violent behavior. And that's a huge misunderstanding that a lot of people have. I'm not necessarily saying you all, but when I go out and talk to like the average person, people who aren't studying for degrees in psychology, that really throws them off. They assume that we were actually chatting over breakfast this morning about the Nick Reiner story that was in the news a few months ago. Nick Reiner murdered his mother and father. His father was Rob Reiner, a very famous and successful Hollywood director. And so you see those kinds of really scary tragedies, and that's what is in people's minds when they hear the term psychosis, right? But psychosis does not necessarily mean violence. There's something called egosyntonic psychotic delusions or hallucinations that can actually be comforting or relaxing for some individuals experiencing them. So when you hear that someone is experiencing psychosis, don't automatically assume that means that it's violent, dysphoric, agitation, irritability, that kind of stuff. We're going to transition here for the next few minutes to talking about my own individual journey with bipolar disorder. I share this not to make myself sound very important or special or anything. I just very truly believe that these are stories that need to be shared more openly. I was a student here. I was going through some really big trials and tribulations in those days. And now I like to share about that, so if other people encounter similar things, they might have some idea of what to expect or have some examples of what helped me as an individual. Okay. Typically when I've come up here previously, I started with the college experience, but when I was putting this presentation together for this spring semester, I realized that it's worth mentioning that my journey with psychology and mental health treatment really began when I was a kid. In the year 2000, when I was about 7 years old, I was diagnosed with ADHD, and I was actually placed on stimulant medication by a psychiatrist, and I took that throughout my childhood. So that was kind of my initial exposure to psychiatry, and being told that you have a disorder, you have a psychological condition. I was an AP scholar and varsity athlete in high school. I did really well academically, and I took school very seriously, but I also began experimenting with drugs and alcohol maybe around the age of 16, and it wasn't necessarily something that was a major red flag to me at the time. But as I got older and got into school here at Penn State, that casual drinking and drug use on weekends started becoming a lot more prevalent in my life. And it started becoming this sort of thing that was really derailing me in terms of being able to, be a good student. I enrolled at Penn State in fall of 2011. I had a pretty typical freshman year. Went to my classes, didn't have any academic issues or anything. I had a lot of good friends. We were all living in the East residence halls. I'm sure a lot of y'all were out there in the East residence halls. Back then, they were not updated. They hadn't been renovated in quite some time, so I know they look different now. But yeah, it was a pretty typical freshman year. I was going out, I was partying and stuff, but it wasn't like I was self-medicating for what I was, what could have been underlying symptoms of mental illness. In my spring semester of my sophomore year, I started encountering what I now recognize were major depressive episodes, where I would basically drag myself to class and then just go back to my dorm room, and I would, not really go out much. I would, use substances, I would drink by myself, and it started becoming a lot darker, which is one thing. So I was starting to think to myself, after that semester happened and that behavior and sort of in activity continued, I started realizing, maybe there is something deeper going on, because the people around me, my friends, my peers, were not engaging with, that party lifestyle the way I was. And I'm using air quotes there. So by my senior year, I graduated in fall 2014. And during that senior semester, I started encountering hypomanic episodes. And that was a lot different because I was used to feeling down, used to feeling depressed. But in my final semester here at Penn State, I started feeling really elevated. I was like going out and partying, and then I would like get home, not sleep, drink a bunch of coffee, and then go to class just on the regular. And I was doing really well in my classes, and I was really into the material that I was learning, and I was getting really, really stoked about it. I thought I had all these amazing ideas about like research that I wanted to pursue, education. Like I strongly thought that I was going to pursue a PhD at the time. And so I had all these great ideas that started bleeding into grandiose ideas. And my behavior started changing. And so faculty members here who like I worked for as a research assistant, some people started kind of noticing. They would be like, hey, you're talking kind of loudly, you're talking kind of quickly, like, you all right? And I would just be like, yeah, I didn't even realize that I was doing it. But so I would be talking excessively, I would have these flights of ideas, I would have these very high-minded ideas about things. And I graduated from Penn State a semester early in December of 2014. I thought that was the biggest hurdle that I would have to overcome. I thought everything was going to be essentially smooth sailing from there. Now that I had my bachelor's degree and no longer had to worry about exams and studying and all those things, I was like, cool, I'm just going to get a job where I'm going to go to grad school and then I'll just kill it and everything will be great. That is not really what played out. Instead, things look like this. And I will say that I'm going to give you a very condensed overview of my journey with mental illness. This is actually what I would call a bit of a manic odyssey. I've written a couple of full-length memoirs where I talk about the details of this extensively, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here, but basically within a month of graduating from Penn State, I decided to take a road trip to New Orleans, Louisiana, because I just thought it sounded like a cool thing to do. And I was like, I'm going to take a vacation. So I included the map. So this is where I left from in Northern Virginia. Down here, that's New Orleans. Boom, boom. A long drive, but like doable. It was supposed to stop here, but by the time I was in New Orleans, I was so manic that I just wanted to keep driving and driving. And I was getting like I got a phone call from one of my buddies who was all the way up in Montana, and he was like, hey dude, what you up to? I was like, I'm on a road trip. And one thing led to another, and next thing I knew, I drove an additional basically 2,000 miles up through the Rocky Mountains, pulling over at dive bars every night, getting hammered because I couldn't sleep, and so I was basically using alcohol as a sleep aid. I wasn't taking medication, I wasn't working with a therapist. I didn't realize how dangerous things were becoming. But by the time I got home to my parents' place where I was living in Northern Virginia, and that road trip lasted maybe 6 weeks or so, and I returned to my family's home, and my parents, within, an hour, were highly concerned. I got back from the trip, I was so irritable, I looked strung out. My parents were very concerned, and they kind of strong-armed me into seeing a psychiatrist for the first time as an adult. So I went to see a psychiatrist. I saw the psychiatrist for a couple of appointments, and she diagnosed me with bipolar disorder, and she told me I was having a manic episode. So for the first time in my life, I was actually prescribed mood stabilizers and antipsychotic medication, and also anti-anxiety medication. I didn't take those pills as prescribed, which was a huge problem because even though I started working with a psychiatrist technically, I wasn't taking my meds properly. I was like abusing the narcotic anxiety medication and then not taking the mood stabilizers or antipsychotics, which is not something I would recommend. I don't provide medical advice, but like, listen to your doctor, I think is what I'll say about that. My symptoms spiraled out. It got to the point where not only was I getting into arguments with my family and stuff, but my psychiatrist was calling police. I was having police come to my house. I talked my way out of probably 4 or 5 separate police interactions during that like March through May of 2015 timeframe. But there was one night where the cops got called to my parents' place. I was really drunk, I just made kind of a not best practice move when talking to a police officer, and I was detained. And just to clarify what I mean by that, I was sitting on a couch in my basement surrounded by cops who were questioning me. And because I was surrounded by so many people, and I'm seated, they're standing, it felt very unnerving, very uncomfortable. And so I kind of just instinctively just kind of stood up from the couch. I didn't say anything, I didn't do anything threatening, I just stood up, and they immediately like handcuffed me. And so then I was taken to a psychiatric hospital, and I was put in the hospital on what's known in the state of Virginia as I believe a civil detainment or a civil court order, something to that effect. Essentially, I was required by a judge to remain in the psych ward for a week, and I was effectively involuntarily hospitalized. So that was a really intense experience. I think the maybe more commonly heard narrative that a lot of people hear is that like you go to the hospital and then you get the help you need, you know, that cliche, and then everything kind of works itself out. That wasn't my experience. My psych hospitalization was very traumatizing. I still feel kind of messed up about it, you know, almost 15 years later. So I would just say that my own experience in the psych hospital wasn't great. When I got out of the psych hospital, where I was forced to take medication for a week, after I got out, I immediately stopped taking those meds again. And I fell into a really bad depression that lasted for most of that summer. Extremely dark, extremely dangerous time in my life where I didn't really have a lot of direction. I was still abusing alcohol a lot, and basically living in my parents' basement, just not doing anything, just like getting drunk all day and feeling miserable. And it was terrible. And so by like July of that year, I realized if I continue like this, I probably will die, either accidentally or intentionally. And no one was talking to me about any of this stuff. I didn't have any friends at the time. I had alienated everyone in my life. I wasn't working with a therapist. Like I said, I wasn't taking medication. I was just white knuckling it through. And I thought about it, and something that I had done in high school that I had enjoyed was volunteering in my community. And so, in retrospect, that was actually, for me, just speaking from my individual perspective, that was the big turning point that basically jump-started my recovery. And so I started volunteering at a local mental health clinic in Northern Virginia, and which is ironic. They took me because I had a bachelor's degree in psych at the time, you know, and still do. But with the psych degree, they didn't really ask any questions. They were like, oh, hey, like, oh, you want to volunteer? Oh, you went to Penn State? You got your psych degree? Okay, sure, yeah, come on. They didn't ask me, like, hey, how are you doing now? I was super depressed. I was not really in a good mental space. But by having that structure and the ability to get out of the house, not be able to enable my own addictive tendencies throughout the day, it was a really, really good change of pace. And after doing that, you know, maybe 25 or 30 hours a week for the rest of that summer, I was able to use that volunteer experience, recraft my resume, and I was able to actually get a full-time paid position working with a social services agency in Virginia. And that was really how it all began. I know that was a very condensed overview, and I can tell you more about anything you would like to hear more about during the Q&A in a few minutes. So late summer 2015, it wasn't easy. It wasn't like an overnight change. I still, for years, really felt out of sorts. I wasn't really sure who I was as an individual, like what my identity was, but I kind of kept grinding. I kept my social services job. I eventually got into talent acquisition stuff, and now, all these years later, am residing in Roanoke, Virginia, in a house on a mountain, which has been my dream for many years. So I guess you could say that although it hasn't been easy, like at least in this example that I've shared with you, you can still have a productive life even if you have been diagnosed with a serious mental illness. And let me also just kind of, in terms of like breaking the fourth wall for a second, I know that I'm not the only person in this room who has like a diagnosed mental health problem, and I'm sure that there are maybe some people in here who have been in psych hospitals or have been told that they have a disorder of some kind. And I know it can be scary and make you doubt yourself and reevaluate a lot of things, which is not a bad thing necessarily, but do keep in mind that it's not your entire identity. Let me tell you about Bipolar Recorder Project. As my recovery journey began, I started doing, I started writing about my life, and I started sending out articles to like National Alliance on Mental Illness. Important to mention, the volunteering in my community was important. The other important thing was getting sober from alcohol and like hardcore street drug type stuff. So I started writing these articles as I got like further into my sober recovery journey or harm reduction journey or whatever you want to call it. I started writing articles. National Alliance on Mental Illness published a very short article that I wrote about addiction recovery in December of 2019. That inspired me to start writing more extensively about my experience with mental health and well-being. And I published a full-length memoir called My Brain is Trying to Kill Me in June of 2020. That led to the Bipolar Recorder Podcast because people started writing to me after finding my work, and they were like, hey, this is cool, like you should do a podcast. And I was like, okay, I love podcasting, I like creating content, and I like telling people about mental health stuff, so sure. So podcast launches, I kind of brand my mental health work as Bipolar Recorder Project. We, in 2022, launched a great online peer support community on the Twitter or X platform that was very popular for a long time. For a long time, we were on the Twitter Spaces platform, and I was able to connect with like literally thousands of people across the world and talk to them about like my experiences and hear about their experiences, and it became this whole component of the wider mental health outreach mission. The university outreach began in October 2023. That's when Dr. Weimer invited me up here to Penn State, and as you can see, that's something we're still doing today. We launched a documentary film in May 2024. Dr. Weimer appeared in that as well. And that's available on YouTube if anyone would like to check out our mini documentary. It's called Exploring New Frontiers for Mental Health Support, or you can just Google Bipolar Recorder mini documentary. So that's like a 20-minute long video where I talk about the peer support space community and how we've incorporated that into our overall mission of support and outreach. Okay, and then finally, last thing I'll say on this slide, I've continued writing over the years, and last February, my latest memoir, Happy Valleys, A Bipolar Journey, was published, and that is a expose on my time, as you could probably infer from the title, my time at Penn State, and also the aftermath of the manic episode that I was telling you about. And as we rethink mental health resources in 2026, I would just like to remind you all, suicide is still a public health crisis. Larger scale advocacy organizations, I have noticed, may not always reflect what people with mental illness really want or need, or at least not reflect all the full spectrum of stances and viewpoints that people living with these types of conditions have. I do include on this slide that like NAMI does receive a lot of funding from pharmaceutical companies. They obfuscate their exact funding sources, but just for me, like that's a little concerning. And it makes me question the overall intent of some of what they do. For people with mental illness, professional support can be intrusive and even dangerous in the format that we currently understand it. So I told you about being approached by police several times, about being forced into a psych hospital where I was injected without my consent to like mind-altering psychotropic drugs and stuff. That is the status quo high-level care that is currently being posited as a resource for people like me and millions of other Americans as being like kind of, okay, we don't know what else to do, so maybe we'll send you here. That doesn't totally sit well with me. I personally would like to see better resources for mental health crisis support. All right, finally, we're going to transition to the Q&A now. Our third element that we talked about in the documentary and that we've kind of continued using, we've jokingly called it the third element after, professional support and therapy and medication. The third element would be community, finding people who like you feel you belong with and you feel supported by. So some parting questions for you. What factors are impacting you and your peers' mental health? They could be good or bad. What kind of supportive resources do you think would be helpful? Like, what would that look like? And then finally, how do you want to be thought of by your community? I know that's a little different than the other questions. The reason I included it is because it's something I've been asking myself a lot lately. Like, how do you want to be thought of? Like, a community isn't just external. Like, you're part of a community too, whether you see it that way or not. So like, what do you think is a way that you would like to be perceived by your community? And why would you feel that way? All right, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you. Thank you.
What's up? This is Hunter back at the Bipolar Recorder HQ in Roanoke, Virginia. I've been back down here for the last few weeks and I'm so glad I've finally been able to get this video out. I hope you enjoyed it. If you feel like you got something out of this, if you feel like you would like to continue supporting independent mental health content, check out bipolarrecorder.com for more information and for our shop page. Thank you so much.